Hello, everyone, all you EDU631 Monday night students. It's good to see you again. Actually, today is March 16th, and this is the pre-recorded now session that was canceled on March 2nd from the condo in Puerto Rico because we had a bad connection. And my, oh my, what a difference 13 days makes. My biggest problem back on the 2nd was the fact that I couldn't connect with you. And now 13 days later, all of you are coping with a total upheaval, most likely in your school districts and your school buildings. And for that, I want to applaud you. Your stick-to-itiveness, your creativity, your coping mechanisms are really quite outstanding. I'm fortunate to not have to deal with it firsthand, but I do want to applaud you for everything that you all are doing. So here's the lesson from March 2nd. I've decided to do it. At one point in time, I thought I would not, but I think I at least owe it to you to try to fill this gap in the curriculum. Let's get right into it. Try to turn this into maybe just about 30 to 45-minute presentation. So as I said, we are recording. As I said, this will be the agenda for March 2nd. It was 6 of 14. We'll quickly review what we did on February 24th, a lifetime ago, and then continue with this discussion about ongoing communication with families. All right. I do want to remind you, please send me your questions for Brina Booth. I hope she can still be with us on April 6th. It'll be really unique to be able to talk to a practicing administrator, her first time around in one of these types of crises, and see what she's doing to keep her district afloat. So do send me your questions just in an email. Please, quick review from February 24th. We're talking about what constitutes community engagement. I alerted you to this website. It's no longer a link, unfortunately, but still it had a lot of good resources in it. It defined community engagement, process of involving people. Remember, in Colorado, this school board believes community engagement at the highest level, but we talked about a number of different levels in between. All right. This screenshot that we saw here, all right, uses pejorative terms for lower levels of participation, but they're legitimate. All right. No non-participation, tokenism, citizen power. This is where Colorado resides, but there's all kinds of things that you can do in between that constitute legitimate community engagement. We talked about who's involved in community engagement at the district level. We talked about who the stakeholders are to give you a good idea about the types of individuals you would involve in your planning. And boy, if the coronavirus doesn't constitute a community engagement necessity, I don't know what does. And these are the types of people, these groups that you would engage, a superintendent would engage in order to share plans, to get ideas, to communicate with the community about what's coming. We talk about how to identify the stakeholders. This is not currently for supers. This is as you're trying to learn who is in your community and who are your stakeholders. I advise you to take a look at websites. Use Google to find out who the different stakeholders are in your community. All right. Wanted to make you realize that this was just not something that NU chose to focus on, but in fact, the state education department has a regulation, 100.19, which requires, if you are a restructuring or persistently failing school, it requires you to engage the community. We looked at what those regulations were and saw all the different things that were required, which are basically what we're talking about in this class. That's what 100.19 requires. Here was a community engagement issues test, a scenario that you can go through when considering whether or not you want to bring an issue to the community. We talked about better community engagement questions. Those that don't have a right or wrong answer, they tend to be more open-ended and geared to your stakeholders' level of understanding, and not necessarily what you understand to be, well, you know the graduation requirements, right? Your community doesn't know that, so you have to ask different questions. We talked about a planning guide provided to us by Colorado. Looked a lot like Plan to Plan. I recommended that you keep this for future reference. We have community engagement case studies. take a look at those. Then we went through our own case study around typical initiatives that a superintendent would get engaged in if he was involved in a capital project, budget vote, district consolidation, school closing, etc. And hey, remember that? You actually had school closing on our list. That really hits home now when we think of where we're at in the US of A and across the globe. So let's get into tonight's session, and I'll try to make it very brief. We're still trying to understand, engage, and effectively collaborate and communicate with our community. Now we're going to talk about communicating with families. Discussion about why should we communicate with families? What types of communication does a superintendent engage in? Because that's different than, say, a teacher or a building principal. Superintendent's communication with families is a bit different. With whom does the superintendent communicate? And the crisis communication, how to use digital media. I told you before that I chose that example of crisis communication, not because I wanted to get into crisis communication, but because the simulation or the case study that I'm looking at coming out of a college, university, described how they use different types of digital media. So it's that reason that I chose to stay with this case study. So from a superintendent's perspective, why should we communicate with families? Well, we can get some ideas from this All About Adolescent Literacy webpage, which speaks to the issue about building trust with schools and diverse families, all right? And we're looking here at what the research says, and it's also what common sense will tell us, that the more we can engage families, the more we can get parental involvement in schools. The research actually says that students do better. Students with involved parents, regardless of income and background, are more likely to earn higher grades and test scores, enroll in higher level programs, be promoted, pass their classes, attend school regularly, have better social skills, improve behavior, and graduate and go on to post-secondary education. So that's what the research says and why it's important to engage families. But despite these findings, many schools struggle to actively engage high numbers of parents and other family members in children's schooling. And I think if you were with me today and I went around the room and asked you to raise your hands, you would probably tell me that at the elementary level, your amount of parent engagement is relatively healthy. And then when you move through the middle school, it tends to lag off a little bit. And by the time we get to high school, community engagement at the high school, family engagement, at the high school level tends to be around, well, things like sporting events and plays and musicals, et cetera, et cetera. You don't necessarily get the high level of family engagement at the secondary level that you do at the elementary level. So here are some core concepts about trust, culture, and family involvement. And let's set this up. Let's not forget that we're talking about family engagement in very diverse communities. Our communities are either becoming more diverse or they are already diverse. And that's especially the case in the big 5 cities in New York State. Then even some of our rural communities are finding that their diversity is changing. And where trust, culture, and family involvement is becoming even more of a challenge. So trust is an individual or group's willingness to be vulnerable to another party based on the confidence that the latter party, that's us in schools, is benevolent, reliable, competent, honest, and open. Trustworthiness then is typically judged according to these 5 main facets. If we are judged to be benevolent, reliable, competent, honest, and open. And this is particularly important to me, having worked in a school district that 25% of the students were Native American. And a lot of these issues of trust it's getting better now after 4 to 5 generations. But in Western New York and in Canada as well, and all across this country, the Native communities had the experience back in the late 1890s up until 1950 in this area, where students, Native American students, were taken from their families and were placed in Indian education schools. And there are some somewhat nasty stories coming out of that experience where kill the Indian, save the man was a typical saying back then. Students were not allowed to speak their language. They weren't allowed to see their parents. Their parents were often, frankly, in destitute situations. And these children went through the boarding school experience. And it's taken 3 to 4 generations of trust, reliability, competence, and openness to be overcome. And once you lose trust, it's hard to get it back. If families are to trust teachers and other school staff members, in other words, they must believe that school personnel are qualified, fair, and dependable. I think we have the same situation happening in a lot of our city schools, where minority students hear stories from their minority parents about how they were treated in schools. There's plenty of anecdotal records about how students were treated in schools. And it's also true that there are different perceptions about treatment in schools. And that cultural base, that cultural point of view plays into our perceptions about what really happened in school. And there are a lot of parents who don't feel that they and their grandparents also were treated fairly, that the staff was dependable, not a racist staff. There's a lot to overcome. Race in this country continues to be a really problematic issue for us. And this is back to go on to the more parties interact over time, however, the more the willingness to trust one another is based upon those parties' actions. And that started to happen in Rwanda after 4 generations of distrust, just by more interaction between the parties and more engagement, purposeful engagement. Culture is another important aspect of dealing with families in diverse communities. Culture is a way of life, especially as it relates to the socially transmitted habits, customs, traditions, and beliefs that characterize a particular group of people at a particular time. And those of you working in very diverse communities can attest to this. Not only are you having, as staff members, having to learn more about Hispanic culture, but Mideastern culture, Asian cultures, African cultures. It's a real challenge. And there's no ready book that you can go to, or professional development that you can bring in your district that's going to cover all of those topics and really make you an expert after 7 hours of a PD session. One model commonly used as an entry point into discussions about cultural differences places cultural groups along a continuum from highly individualistic to highly collectivist. And to make the point, I'll again draw on my experiences. Many of you may know what's referred to as the nuclear family. The nuclear family is the concept that grew out of the post-war industrialized USA, where the nuclear family was one mother, one father, and 2 children in the household. And that lasted up until about the 1970s. Then things started to change. However, if you take a look at other cultures, Asian culture, Japanese culture, Native American culture, I'm possibly African American culture as well. There you will find that it's not a nuclear family concept. There you will have aunts and uncles and grandmas and grandpas living in the same household. And these days also we have culture, we have families with 2 moms and 2 dads and maybe no dad and or no mom. Children are living with their grandparents. So the family culture is very different and diverse in our communities. And it's incumbent upon us to understand that. As Trumbull stresses, being aware that different cultural orientations exist is extremely invaluable in developing programs, policies, and activities that build on the strengths and values of a diverse school community. So when you plan your activities in your schools, are you paying attention to the diversity? Or are you just programming for that one white middle class majority that you might be experiencing in your school? All right. Getting to know students and their family members as individuals, participating in social activities in the community, visiting families at home and asking parents to share their views are all good ways for educators to broaden their understanding of family and cultural diversity. In other words, get out of your office and attend community events. This is one of the very important roles of a superintendent and a building principal, to attend community events. And even if they are smaller events held in pockets of your community, maybe like in nearby Lackawanna here, there is a Yemeni community on the west side, the Grant Street area of Buffalo. There is also a Sahara desert country migration that's occurred and revitalizing that part of the community. You might find attending a community event in that part of your district is important to get to know people. Family involvement, a third element, also referred to as parent involvement, school-family collaboration, school-family partnerships. Family involvement refers to a wide range of activities. And now let's expand this idea about what in family involvement entails, because for this writer, there are 6 main categories of involvement on a continuum. We have parenting, communicating with schools, volunteering at school, supporting learning at home, participating in school governance and decision-making, and taking part in school community collaborations such as adult literacy classes and tutorial services. These are all forms of family involvement. Now, let's make it real for superintendent. What types of communication does the superintendent engage in with families? Well, when I did a brain dump here at my desk, I came up with 4 different domains, if you will, or quadrants where a superintendent would engage with in families. You have the personal and professional, the routine, the formal, and the extraordinary. So in the personal and professional, this is the superintendent being a friendly neighbor. You're attending community functions, civic functions, church functions, not only the church that you belong to, but the church others would belong to, school functions. You will attend athletic contests, art, music, drama presentations, attend parent organization meetings. Yes, these are all things that you should be doing on a regular basis in your role as a superintendent. Getting involved in the community, well, shaking people's hands, giving them an elbow bump these days, talking with parents, getting to know grandparents, just being out there and being your social self. That's very important. Then you're going to find yourself being involved with the community on a routine basis. Your regular board meetings, they may be televised. Individuals may be watching your board meetings, whether they're live or recorded. You'll be asked to be a guest speaker at events. You're a leader in the community. People will ask for your opinions, and you find yourself being a guest speaker at events. And also a routine engagement with the community is over issues such as snow days, or in these extreme circumstances, health and quarantine issues that are now becoming the norm in our society. You'll also find yourself engaging in community in a very formal way. You are the face of your public hearings. Your annual budget meeting that's required be held in May. You will most likely be the speaker as a superintendent at that budget meeting, along with your school business official and your board president. If you are going through issues like a reorganization in your district, if you are looking to close a school because your student population is declining, now that's an instance where you're going to be engaging families. And also capital projects is an issue where you're out there engaging the families in the community, all right? And then you have the extraordinary. And these would be, well, let's back up. Let's not forget. The formal also in this day and age would also have to do with things like school closings, having to do with things like the coronavirus, all right, and how you're going to engage families when school closes down. And again, I just have to think of all the different media that you have at your disposal. You could broadcast a message and put it on. If you have closed circuit TV, like we did in Gowanda, you have your own television channel. You can record your message and put it on your television channel, or you can do live presentations. So many school districts have that capability. Then you have your extraordinary. Unfortunately, these happen as well. But there is positive. You may find yourself engaging with families in the community around milestone celebrations, anniversaries, retirement parties, things of that nature. But then you're going to have your crises and your natural disasters as well, which is what you're experiencing right now. And then, unfortunately, there will always be deaths and other catastrophes that hit individuals and families in your district, and that you are a central figure in those extraordinary events. Now, as I said earlier, we have the issue of diversity in our school districts, and we want to take a look at the national immigration trends to define diversity, examine the data, and explore the available resources. because again, the diversity defines the families, the diversity defines the community defines the families, and it's our role and our responsibility to make sure that we engage all different types of families in our communities. So just a wheel to look at here, what constitutes a diverse community and classroom? Just some elements of that. What makes us diverse? Our age makes us diverse, our gender makes us diverse, our religious affiliation or not. Maybe we don't, maybe individuals in our community do not practice a religion. Sexual orientation matters, that's a matter of gender as well. That's becoming very fluid. Back in the simple 70s and 80s and 90s, when I was in your positions, there was male and female was what you dealt with, and that isn't to say that there were not diverse gender or sexual orientation. It's just that it never made it to the forefront. Today, of course, gender and sexual orientation is along a continuum, and we need to recognize that in our families. Intellectual aptitude makes us diverse. Physical ability, handicap and condition, different morals and ethics, a different culture, different language, different family unit. Certainly these starred issues are very much at play these days because of the immigration and the different backgrounds of the families who are moving into our districts. Makes it very important that we understand how diverse we really are. When preparing for class, I took a look at one school district, well, looked at many, but just take a look at New York City as an example of how to access and use data to understand the level of diversity in your school district. New York City is so diverse that they actually have a division of English language learners and student support, and they issue a report. When I started to look at New York City, I noticed this selected language on the New York City Department of Education webpage and took a look at that and found out that, oh my goodness, you'll find 100 different languages. So they can translate their webpage to 100 different languages, indicating the diversity of New York City and the children in those schools. This is just a table of contents of that report. In this report, let's take a look at the graphs. We find this is showing us the ELL enrollment by borough. And we find that Queens, Brooklyn, the Bronx have about between 26 and 30% of ELL students. And then the remaining, Manhattan, Staten Island, makes about 15% of ELL students. So you can see, let's use an average, about 25% of the students enrolled in New York City schools are ELL students. That fact alone is amazing to me. Here are the actual numbers, all right, and the percentages. Now, here's the top 10 places of birth for ELLs in New York City schools. Even those in the United States of America, born in the US citizens, are still classified, 50% of them, of the ELLs come from the United States of America. Then 17% of the ELLs enrolled in New York City schools are from the Dominican Republic. Then we have China, Yemen, Bangladesh, Ecuador, Uzbekistan, Haiti, Honduras, and El Salvador. Those are the top 10. The languages, the top 10 languages, remember there are 102 languages. Top 10 languages are Spanish, Chinese, or Arabic, Bengali, Russian, Urdu, Haitian Creole, French, Uzbek, and Punjabi. I understand from talking to you New York City folks that if you need a translator for a parent who you're meeting with to deal with the student issue, you can place a telephone call to a central clearinghouse and you'll be able to get a translator. They talk about the programs and supports for students. And if we were all together, I would ask you, anecdotally speaking, what does diversity look like in your school district? Ask yourself that question. and you'll know why we're speaking about diversity and diverse families. I took a look at some of the typical school districts in this area where I knew that we had students either in this class or the Tuesday night class. So I took a look at Niagara Falls. Here's Niagara Falls enrollment by ethnicity. This is the 17-18 school year. 35% of the students in Niagara Falls are African American. 41% are white. Very diverse in that respects. Other groups, 18% of those students are in Niagara Falls are students with disabilities. 76% are economically disadvantaged. Because let's keep in mind, the color of our skin is not the only thing that determines our diversity. All right, there are other things as well. Homeless, parent-time services, economic disadvantages, students with disability, English language learners. Okay. Here's Syracuse City Schools, one of the big five. Here we find that 50% of the students in Syracuse are African American. 22% are white. In Syracuse, 20% of the students have disabilities, and 88% are economically disadvantaged. In Western New York, there's a small city school district called Dunkirk, beautiful little school district right on Lake Erie. But let me get some history and background. This is a farming area where I live. And down in Dunkirk as well, Dunkirk-Fredonia area, there are a lot of grape fields and a lot of berry fields and a lot of tomatoes and peppers, etc. Point being that back in the 50s and the 60s, the migrant population that came up to work on the farms was primarily Puerto Rican. Where I grew up in North Collins, there was a large Puerto Rican population, and it was greater in the summertime when the fields had to be picked. And what happened in Dunkirk, many of those families in the 50s, 60s stayed. And so much so that today, Dunkirk has the majority of the students are Hispanic or Latino, based upon that migrant farm working situation. And 36% are white in 17-18. Students with disabilities, 11%, 69% economically disadvantaged. Do I have any more? Well, yes, I thought I would go back and do some comparisons here, which is just, frankly, just the same thing you're doing for me in class. This is why I'm having you do the assignment, because it's useful. I went back and looked at 07, 08 and compared to 17, 18 to see how much of a change. And you can see 10 years ago, the red, the Hispanic population, all right, was about 780 students at the time. Now it's about 1,000, about 1,050. Pardon me. So there has been a large increase in the Hispanic population and a decrease in the white population. African American as well, population has declined in Dunkirk. Here are the percentages. Enrollment by Hispanic enrollment back then, 20%. Now 55. Now, certainly a companion issue that goes along with the diverse students in our schools has to do with the diversity of those of us who teach them or who are administrative leaders. Sorry, I'm getting a little tickle. America's public school teachers are far less racially and ethnically diverse than their students, and this is a problem. This comes from the Pew Research Center. And we find here that non-whites made up a small share of public school teachers in 15-16. So this is charting the percent of teachers who are non-white by school trade. So the traditional schools, non-white teachers make up 19% of the teachers in traditional schools. In charter schools, non-white teachers make up 29% of the teaching ranks. In the city schools, non-white teachers make up 31% of the teacher ranks. In rural schools, which tend to be much whiter, non-white teachers make up only 11%. When we find, all right, let's think of the graphs we just looked at, where we had non-white students making up between 50 to 74% of the population. All right, think of Dunkirk was at 55%. Those large city schools were up to about 75%. So in these when the students are non-white, between 50 to 74%, only 20% of the teachers in those schools are non-white. When you find yourselves in predominantly non-white schools, then at least up to 55% of the teachers are non-white. All right. And when we're dealing with our poor children, all right, obviously when we have well-to-do school districts where 0 to 25% of the students participate in free and reduced lunch, then only 11% of the teachers are non-white. When we look at high poverty districts, 34%. Why does this matter? If we look at the Brookings Institution, we find that minority students often perform better on standardized tests, have improved attendance, and are suspended less frequently when they have at least one same race teacher, at least one same race teacher. So this obviously cries out for the need to recruit minority teachers and administrators to get jobs in our public schools and in our charter schools as well. So let's take a look at some research data on immigration and the impact on PK through 12 education. And we've been here for 32 minutes now. Draw your attention to the Center for Immigration Studies, mapping the impact of immigration on public schools. Here's a nationwide map of where most of the immigrant population has landed, so to speak. Will come as no surprise along the California, Arizona, and the Texican border with Mexico. We find many immigrant students. And then if we had a better look at the cities, we would probably see that too. Sometimes we see anomalies like here in the center of the country, and Kansas, I'm thinking, yep, Kansas, meatpacking area. And that's where you'll find immigrants locating. Up in Washington, I can't necessarily say why up in Washington there's a large concentration of immigrant families as well. Maybe one of you would know that. Sorry for this. Good. Just one of those crank calls. Just like class, right? Among the findings, almost 1 out of 4 public school students in the U.S. came from immigrant households. That kind of bears up with the ELL numbers we were looking at in New York City. All right, almost 1 of 4 public school students in the U.S. comes from immigrant household. In 2015, between 1/4 and 1/3 of public students from immigrant households were the children of illegal immigrants, which brings a whole another panoply of issues when we're talking about illegal immigrants, because we know how fraught the U.S. is right now with ICE making raids on workplaces and the federal government being, quote unquote, very the administration, I should say, the current administration, very unhappy with sanctuary cities. We won't get into that now, except it's a whole other issue that you have to deal with when you're dealing with illegal immigrant families. Immigration is added disproportionately to the number of low-income students in public schools. That brings a whole new set of problems. Immigrants also settle in areas of high poverty, adding to the challenges of schools in these areas. And immigration is added enormously to the population of students who speak a foreign language. All tremendous challenges. And let's bring it home to the coronavirus issue. So many of you are planning on providing home instruction to students via distance learning. What about your ELL students? Those students who don't speak English very well, are you going to be able to meet their needs? What about the needs of students who have IEPs, students who are supposed to have accommodations? What will you do with those students when you're trying distance learning? We'll talk about this specifically when we get back together on March 23rd. Moving, I want to go a little faster for your benefit. 35 minutes so far. So let's look at what we can do as leaders to improve our engagement with diverse families, for our staff and ourselves. Educational leadership gives us some ideas. As diversity grows, so much we engage the entire school community. Make sure that you're not simply focusing on the majority of the students in your schools, but make sure you're dealing with the minority as well. And here's a case study. This is East Ramapo Central School District here in New York State. They had an issue of changing demographics, all right? Leaders in East Ramapo have committed themselves to just such a state system-wide initiative. The school district, which lies across the Tappan Zee Bridge from New York City, has experienced a dramatic shift in the student population in the past 15 years, as low-income Haitians, Jamaicans, Dominicans, Latinos, and Black families from the city have moved into the community, and middle-class white families have unfortunately but predictably fled to the private schools of other less diverse districts. So East Ramapo recognized they had a problem and they needed to do something about it. In the midst of this demographic revolution, East Ramapo had broad-based diversity initiatives, has engaged all groups and constituencies in the school district community, not just teachers and administrators. I'm going to let you stop the recording and read this so that I don't have to take time reading it to yourself. I'm going to go ahead, all right, and let you read this for yourself. You can stop the recording, but they decided to deal with not just training teachers, but training support staff as well. You can read that yourself. You can read this yourself. We get to the rub of it. East Ramapo's efforts were successful. And they actually put together a family resource center as a result of this initiative to address the diverse nature of East Ramapo. Why did I go to this case study? Because you have to be purposeful. All right? These problems don't solve themselves. They don't simply go away through assimilation. The responsibility of a school district leader is to work with your community to define the problem, share the data, bring in the stakeholders, and decide what you need to do to make a better place. And that's what East Ramapo did, and I'm offering it to you as a case study and a form of encouragement. Here's a couple of resources for you. Color in Colorado. Through my Googling, I came across Color in Colorado. I refer you to it. It really is a good resource because it not just talks about it's primarily a bilingual site for ELL students and Spanish speaking as well, but it has issues about the law are supported here, school support, teaching ELLs, things for the families, things that you need to know as an administrator. All right, very good site. Bookmark it. Another very good one. All right, Pacer Center, Champions for Children with Disabilities, but getting off to a good start, positive interaction with diverse families. I found a lot of good resources here as well, and I'll draw your attention to those too. Now, we're going to end here on this crisis communication. Remember, like I said earlier, I didn't choose this because it was about a crisis, but I chose it because the individuals who spoke to us about it, all right, here, this case study really talked about expanding your reach with social media, and that's what I wanted to focus on, all right? Back one slide. Examples of school-related crises. How about natural disasters, shootings and other violence, suicides, family violence, sexual assault, grief and loss, hostage situations. I guess I'll put under natural disasters, I'll put epidemics, pan-epidemics as a form of a natural disaster. All right, so let's take a look at the case study in crisis communication, expanding your reach with social media, all right? Tulane was in the area that was struck by Hurricane Isaac, and they had to get through this, all right? And they use social media to a large extent. I'm going to let you read this, all right? I don't need to go through it. But do take a look at how they use the different types of media to communicate with their families and with their wider community. They use their website. That was their communication base, all right? But these days, websites tend to be rather static, all right? And they needed some more dynamic tools as well. They had a telephone hotline. In schools, you can do this these days. You all can purchase a service where you can have a telephone hotline and push out your message. We all use it. A lot of us use it for calling snow days. You can use it for a lot of different purposes as well. Email is good if you have everyone's address in your system. If you don't have parent or community emails in your system, you can't push it out. So that gets us back to making sure that you have a systems approach to all of this. If you want to send out emails, if you want to send out telephone hotlines, you have to have those email addresses and those telephone numbers in your system to begin with. Ask yourself the question, do you have that? Twitter accounts. Well, Twitter accounts and Facebook accounts obviously are very good. Everyone uses them, but they only reach those who have a Twitter account or have a Facebook account. If your parents don't maintain these Twitter accounts and Facebook, then you can't reach them, which is why you need to have the backups. It's all a matter of having contingencies and backups. A couple strategies to remember, we're just talking about. You have to have multiple avenues. All right, emails, website, hotline, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, face-to-face, et cetera, et cetera. And yeah, face-to-face, don't forget to get out into your community to speak to your constituents. Expectations were set before the storm. Emergency notices were updated regularly. Specific and detailed information calmed fears. Updated fact sheets. Let me make clear to you, your communication plans have got to be in place prior to the emergencies. Now, if you're worried, how do you do that? And if you're a superintendent candidate who just got a job and are moving into a district, first thing you do, call the state police and your local county emergency management offices. They are trained to do this. They will help you set up everything you need to know, everything you need to do, all right, to deal with any type of emergency, including your communication plan. Don't think you have to do it yourself. I've tried to tutor you all along that you're never alone. And the same applies to this. Crisis communication is something that state police and your county emergency management system are trained in helping you with. Give them a call. All right. I'm going to move quickly through this because you can read it. And here's your agenda for March 9th. And as you'll recall, on March 9th, you already had a pre-recorded presentation. And this time, because for some reason, I don't know why Canvas was not displaying the March 9th recording, and then eventually I put it on YouTube. You are looking at this now. You are viewing me now, hopefully at the end, because I put this on YouTube as well, not trusting Canvas to have fixed that problem. So again, thank you for taking the time. I'm so glad that you stayed with me. We're going to get together on March 23rd again. I can't wait to see you again, get a little bit of normalcy going back here again. And we're going to talk about emergency planning because it brings everything that we've talked about so far into play. Things like strategic planning, communication with families, communications with the community, partnerships, all right, crisis communication. We're going to try to make it very real life for all of you and deviate a bit from our planned agenda. So I'll see you again. It's time for me to stop the recording and wish you all very well. Have a good time at home, I hope. If you are at home with your children and your loved ones, make the best use of the time. Slow down if you can. And give your kids a break as well. Take care of yourselves, all right? I look forward to seeing you very soon.